Flames clawed at the night sky as windows burst alarms, shrieking through the upscale apartment complex on Boston's north side. People scattered across the parking lot in various states of undress, clutching phones and pets and whatever valuables they'd managed to grab. Smoke billowed upward, thick and black against the starless night. The building had become a monster devouring itself from within. Jake Turner slammed on his brakes, the pickup truck skidding slightly as he pulled haphazardly alongside the curb. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as his eyes took in the inferno. The orange glow reflected in his windshield, painting his face with dancing shadows. Through the open window came the unmistakable smell of burning timber and melting plastic. "Dad, what are you doing?" Ethan's voice came from the passenger seat, high and frightened. His 10-year-old eyes were wide with fear as he watched his father unbuckle his seatbelt. "Dad, please no." Jake turned to his son, his mind already made up. "Stay in the truck, Ethan. Lock the doors. I'll be right back." His voice was calm but firm, the same tone he used when teaching his son to change a tire or fix a leaky faucet. "But the firefighters, they're coming right. You can hear the sirens." Ethan's voice cracked as he reached for his father's arm, fingers clutching at the worn denim jacket. Jake touched his son's face, a brief moment of tenderness amid the chaos. "Sometimes a man can't wait for help to come, Ethan. Sometimes he has to be that help." He pulled away, his eyes already returning to the building. "I'll be back, I promise." The night air hit Jake's face like a furnace as he slammed the truck door behind him. He could hear Ethan crying now, face pressed against the window, but he couldn't look back. People were shouting, pointing upward. A woman in a bathrobe was screaming something about the fifth floor, about someone still inside. Jake pulled his t-shirt up over his nose and mouth, a meager filter against the smoke. His boots pounded against the pavement as he ran toward the building's entrance, ignoring the shouts telling him to stop, to wait for the professionals. The heat intensified with each step, sweat immediately beading on his forehead. The lobby was hazy but navigable, the fire having started on the upper floors. Jake took the stairs two at a time, his breathing already labored by the third floor. The fourth floor landing brought the first real challenge. Flames licked along one wall, and the smoke was much thicker here. He dropped to a crouch, remembering something he'd read about smoke rising. The air was marginally clearer near the floor. By the fifth floor, Jake was in hell. The hallway was an obstacle course of fallen ceiling panels and flames. The heat was unbearable, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. Sweat stung his eyes as he moved forward, calling out through his shirt. "Anyone here, call out." Something creaked ominously overhead. Jake dodged as a section of ceiling collapsed where he'd been standing seconds before. The roar of the fire was deafening now, a hungry beast consuming everything in its path. Jake moved door to door, pounding his fist against each one, checking handles to see if any were unlocked. At the end of the hall, door yielded to his push. The apartment beyond was filling with smoke, but the flames hadn't reached it yet. Jake moved through the rooms quickly, his eyes stinging and watering. In the bedroom, he found her. She lay on the floor beside the bed, as if she'd tried to escape, but been overcome by the smoke. Even through the haze, Jake could tell she wasn't dressed for bed. She wore what looked like an expensive business suit, though it was now smudged with soot. A gleaming watch caught the light on her wrist as her arm lay outstretched toward the door. Her dark hair was spread around her like a halo on the carpet. Jake didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her head lolled against his chest as he turned back toward the door. The journey out would be harder than the way in. The fire was spreading rapidly, and the woman was dead weight in his arms. The hallway had become an inferno in the minutes he'd spent searching. Jake hugged the wall, trying to find a path through the flames. His lungs burned with every breath, and the woman in his arms remained frighteningly still. A support beam crashed down mere feet away, sending up a shower of sparks and embers. Jake felt one land on his neck, a bright point of pain that he had no free hand to swat away. The stairwell was now a chimney of heat and smoke. Jake descended as quickly as he dared, his boots slipping occasionally on steps now slick with water from the sprinkler system. The woman stirred slightly in his arms, a faint cough escaping her lips. She was alive at least. By the third floor, Jake's legs were trembling with exertion. By the second, his vision was narrowing, dark spots dancing at the edges. The lobby, when he finally reached it, was now crowded with firefighters in full gear. They rushed toward him, voices muffled through their masks, hands reaching for the woman in his arms. Jake surrendered her reluctantly, then doubled over in a fit of coughing as the cool night air hit his smoke-filled lungs. Outside was chaos, flashing lights, shouting voices, the massive fire trucks with their hoses already deployed. Paramedics guided Jake to the back of an ambulance, trying to press an oxygen mask to his face. He pushed it away, eyes searching frantically for his truck, for Ethan. The boy was running toward him across the parking lot, tears streaming down his face. Jake opened his arms just in time to catch his son, pulling him tight against his chest, despite the pain in his lungs. Ethan's shoulders shook with sobs. "I thought you weren't coming back," Ethan choked out against his father's smoke-stained shirt. "I thought you'd leave me too, like Mom did." Jake closed his eyes, his throat tight with emotion that had nothing to do with smoke inhalation. "I will always come back to you, buddy, always." A paramedic approached again, more insistent this time with the oxygen mask. Jake finally relented, keeping one arm firmly around Ethan's shoulders as he breathed in the pure oxygen. His gaze drifted to the ambulance where they had taken the woman he'd rescued. Through the open doors, he could see paramedics working over her, attaching monitors, placing an oxygen mask over her face. Her eyes remained closed, but her chest was rising and falling steadily. "Is she gonna be okay?" Ethan asked, following his father's voice. Jake nodded slowly. "I think so, buddy. She's breathing." "You saved her life," Ethan said, a note of pride breaking through the fear in his voice. Jake didn't answer. He simply held his son closer, watching, as the paramedics closed the ambulance doors. As the vehicle pulled away, sirens wailing, Jake finally allowed the paramedics to guide him to a second ambulance for treatment. His last view of the woman he'd pulled from the fire was of her pale hand hanging limply off the stretcher, that expensive watch still glinting on her wrist. The small house on Cedar Street wasn't much to look at from the outside. Peeling paint on the porch, a patchy lawn that needed mowing, gutters that sagged in places. But it was home. Jake's pickup truck sat in the driveway beside a half-dismantled motorcycle he'd been restoring in his spare time. The garage door was open, revealing a workspace that was more organized than the rest of the property might suggest. Tools hung in careful arrangements on pegboards, parts were sorted into labeled bins. Inside the house was clean but Spartan. The furniture was mismatched, mostly secondhand but well-maintained. The walls were adorned with Ethan's school artwork and a few framed photographs. A younger Jake in a garage with co-workers, Jake and Ethan fishing at a lake, and most prominently a woman with Ethan's eyes and Jake's smile frozen in time 5 years ago. Jake moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, making Ethan's lunch for school. His hands calloused and permanently stained with engine grease, despite rigorous scrubbing, carefully spread peanut butter on bread and sliced an apple into perfect wedges. These same hands that could tear down and rebuild an engine worked with surprising gentleness on this daily ritual. "Dad, are you sure you should go to work today?" Ethan asked from the table where he was finishing his cereal. "Your cough sounds bad." Jake cleared his throat as if to disprove his son's point, but ended up in a brief coughing fit instead. "I'm fine, buddy. Just a little smoke irritation. Doc said it would clear up in a day or two." The hospital had wanted to keep Jake overnight for observation, but he'd refused. Single fathers couldn't afford the luxury of hospital stays, not when there were bills to pay and a son who needed stability. Besides, he genuinely felt okay. Some coughing, a mild headache, and a few minor burns on his hands and neck. Nothing he couldn't handle. "Randy called last night while you were in the shower," Jake said, changing the subject. "Said not to worry about coming in until noon. So I'll drop you at school, get some rest, then head in for the afternoon shift." Ethan nodded, but his eyes remained concerned. At 10, he sometimes seemed older, more aware than Jake would like. The loss of his mother had forced a certain maturity on him. "Did you see the news they're calling you a hero?" Jake snorted softly, zipping Ethan's lunch into his Batman lunchbox. "I just did what needed doing, no heroes required." "But that lady might have died if you didn't go in," Ethan persisted. "They said on the news that the firefighters found 3 more people on other floors, but nobody knew she was in there because she didn't live there. She was visiting someone or something." This was news to Jake. He'd wondered about that, her business attire at that hour in an apartment that didn't quite match her apparent status. "Well, glad everyone made it out then," he said simply. The drive to Ethan's school was quiet, both Turner men lost in their thoughts. Jake's fingers drummed on the steering wheel at stoplights, a nervous habit he'd developed after Sarah died. Ethan watched the familiar neighborhood roll by, occasionally glancing at his father's profile. As they pulled up to the school, Ethan didn't immediately get out. "Dad." "Yeah, buddy. I was really scared last night." Ethan's voice was small, but also kind of proud. "Is that weird?" Jake turned fully toward his son, ignoring the cars queuing behind them. "Not weird at all. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even though you are scared." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Like you did." Jake reached out, ruffled his son's hair gently. "A man takes care of people who need taking care of. That's what your grandpa taught me, and that's what I'm teaching you. Now scoot, or you'll be late." Watching Ethan walk into school, backpack bouncing slightly with each step, Jake felt the familiar ache in his chest. Sarah should be here to see their boy growing up. She'd be proud of him. His kindness, his intelligence, the way he could already identify most car parts and knew the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. Small things maybe, but they were the building blocks of the man he would become. Instead of going home to rest, as he told Ethan he would, Jake drove straight to Turner's Auto Repair. The garage had been in Randy Turner's family for 3 generations, though Randy was only Jake's uncle by marriage. Still, he'd given Jake a job when he'd needed it most after Sarah's medical bills had emptied their savings, and Jake had been forced to leave his engineering position at Techron Systems to care for Ethan. The career change had been a step down in pay and prestige, but a step up in flexibility and peace of mind. Jake could set his own hours around Ethan's schedule, and the work, while physically demanding, didn't follow him home at night the way his engineering projects had. Plus, there was something satisfying about fixing things with his hands, about sending a car back on the road running better than it had in years. Randy looked up from an invoice as Jake walked in, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. "Thought I told you to take the morning off, hero." Jake grimaced at the nickname. "Don't you start too. And sitting at home was just making me antsy." Randy shrugged his massive shoulders. "Suit yourself. Got Mrs. Abernathy's Buick in Bay 3. Power steering pumps shot." Jake nodded, grabbing his coveralls from his locker and pulling them on over his jeans and t-shirt. The familiar routine was comforting after the chaos of the previous night. Within minutes, he was elbow deep in Mrs. Abernathy's engine, the world narrowing to the immediate problem at hand. This was why Jake liked mechanical work. It was straightforward. A car either ran right or it didn't, and if it didn't, there was always a reason, a logical, findable, fixable reason. Unlike life, which sometimes broke in ways that couldn't be repaired, no matter how skilled your hands or how determined your heart. By early afternoon, Jake had finished with the Buick and moved on to a brake job on a Honda Civic. His cough had settled into an occasional irritation, and the garage's classic rock radio station was helping to keep his mind off the events of last night. He was just tightening the last lug nut on the Civic's wheel when Randy appeared beside the car. "You've got a visitor," Randy said, a curious expression on his weathered face. "Real fancy type." Jake slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What do you mean, fancy?" Randy jerked his head toward the office. "See for yourself." Said he works for some big shot. In the small office that served as the garage's reception area stood a man who looked distinctly out of place. Tall and lean, dressed in an immaculate dark suit, he surveyed the humble surroundings with a neutral expression that nonetheless suggested he found them lacking. When Jake entered, the man's gaze immediately fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Turner." The man's voice was deep and cultured. "Jacob Turner." Jake nodded once, suddenly conscious of the grease on his hands and the sweat staining his coveralls. "That's me." The man extended a hand, then seemed to reconsider as he noted the state of Jake's hands. Instead, he reached into an inner pocket and produced a business card which he offered between 2 fingers. "Lawrence Reeves, head of security for Pierce Technologies." Jake accepted the card, studying the sleek black design with its minimalist silver lettering. The logo was vaguely familiar. He'd seen it on buildings downtown and occasionally on TV commercials. Some tech company, he knew that much. "What can I do for you, Mr. Reeves?" Jake asked, genuinely confused about why a corporate security head would be tracking him down at work. "It's regarding the fire last night," Reeves said, his expression giving nothing away. "The woman you rescued was Alexandra Pierce, CEO of Pierce Technologies." Jake blinked, processing this information. The name meant little to him beyond a vague recognition. Alexandra Pierce was one of those people whose names occasionally appeared in news headlines or business magazines, someone important in circles far removed from Jake's daily life. Is she okay? Jake asked the first question that came to mind. Something in Reeves' expression softened marginally. She's recovering well thanks to your actions. She suffered some smoke inhalation and minor burns, but doctors expect a full recovery. Jake nodded, relieved. Good to hear. So, did she send you to say thanks or something? It seemed odd. A card or phone call would have sufficed. Ms. Pierce would like to thank you personally, Reeves said. When she's released from the hospital, she would appreciate the opportunity to express her gratitude face to face. Jake shifted uncomfortably. That's not necessary. I just did what anyone would do. Reeves' expression suggested he very much doubted that. Nevertheless, Ms. Pierce insists. She takes her debts seriously. He produced a second card, this one handwritten. This is her private number. She asked that you call at your convenience to arrange a meeting. Jake reluctantly took the card, not quite sure what to make of this. Look, I don't want anything. I didn't do it for a reward. Ms. Pierce understands that, Reeves said smoothly, but she still wishes to meet the man who saved her life at considerable risk to his own. He glanced around the garage with that same neutral expression that somehow conveyed judgment. She's not accustomed to being in anyone's debt. Before Jake could formulate a response, Reeves checked his watch, an understated but clearly expensive timepiece. I should return to the hospital. Ms. Pierce will be disappointed if you don't call. With a nod that was almost a bow, he turned and left his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place on the oil-stained concrete floor. Randy emerged from where he'd been eavesdropping behind the office door. Holy shit, Jake. You saved Alexandra Pierce. She's like billionaire level rich. Techron's biggest competitor too. Isn't that where you used to work? Jake nodded absently, still staring at the handwritten card. The penmanship was elegant and precise, much like the woman he'd glimpsed briefly through the smoke and chaos. Yeah, it doesn't matter though. I'm not calling. Randy gaped at him. Are you nuts? Lady probably wants to give you a reward. Could set you and Ethan up nice. Jake slipped both cards into his pocket and picked up his wrench. I don't need a reward for doing the decent thing, Randy. And I don't need some rich lady's charity. As he returned to the Honda's brake job, Jake tried to push the encounter from his mind. But the cards seemed to burn in his pocket, a tangible connection to a world he'd once orbited on the periphery. The world of corporate technology innovation and wealth that he'd left behind when Sarah got sick. A world that now seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars. So, Alexandra Pierce's hospital room looked nothing like a typical patient's accommodation. The private suite had been hastily redecorated with tasteful flower arrangements, a higher quality bedding set than the standard hospital issue, and several sleek tablets and laptops arranged on a wheeled desk that had been brought in specifically for her use. The room had become a satellite office for Pierce Technologies, with a constant stream of executives and assistants coming and going despite doctors' recommendations for rest. Alexandra herself sat propped up against pillows, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her normally flawless makeup absent. Still, there was an undeniable air of authority about her as she video-conferenced with her board of directors, her voice slightly raspy from smoke exposure, but her words precise and commanding. The Singapore expansion will proceed as scheduled, she said, cutting off a board member who had suggested delays might be prudent given her condition. My brief hospitalization changes nothing. The contracts are ready for signing next week. Lawrence Reeves entered quietly, standing at the back of the room until Alexandra noticed him. She immediately wrapped up the call, dismissing the concerned faces on the screen with practiced efficiency. You found him, she asked once the screen went dark, her tone suggesting she'd expected nothing less. Reeves nodded, approaching her bedside. Jacob Turner, 37, works as a mechanic at his uncle's garage, widower raising a 10-year-old son alone. Alexandra absorbed this information with a slight nod. And before education background, bachelor's in mechanical engineering from MIT, worked at Techron Systems for 8 years as a product development engineer. Left 5 years ago when his wife was diagnosed with aggressive ovarian cancer. She died 6 months after diagnosis, leaving significant medical debt despite insurance. Something flickered across Alexandra's face. Recognition, perhaps, or sympathy quickly suppressed. Techron. What department? Safety systems. He was part of the team developing their fire suppression technology for commercial buildings. Alexandra's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting coincidence. I thought so too, Reeves agreed. Background check shows he holds 2 patents from his time there, though both are now property of Techron. After his wife's death, he turned down their offer to return to his position, citing need for a more flexible schedule for childcare. Alexandra tapped her fingers against the blanket, a habit she displayed when processing information. Financial situation. Precarious but stable. The house has a mortgage with about $120,000 remaining. Car is paid off but aging. No credit card debt, but minimal savings. He's keeping her head above water, but just barely. Did he agree to meet? Reeves hesitated, which was answer enough. Alexandra's expression hardened slightly. He refused. He didn't outright refuse, Reeves clarified. He said a meeting wasn't necessary, that he didn't want a reward. I left your contact information. Whether he uses it, Alexandra leaned back against her pillows, a brief coughing fit interrupting whatever she'd been about to say. When she recovered, her voice was even raspier. He will. Men like that, they have principles, but they also have responsibilities. His son, he'll call. Reeves looked less certain, but knew better than to contradict his employer directly. There's something else you should know. During my background research, I found something interesting in his garage. Alexandra raised an eyebrow questioningly. He's been developing something in his spare time. A simplified fire detection system, from what I could gather from neighbors' comments. Apparently he's quite handy, fixes things for people in the neighborhood. This information seemed to please Alexandra. A small knowing smile played at her lips. Project Phoenix may have just found its missing piece, Lawrence. You can't be serious, Reeves said before he could stop himself. He's a mechanic. He's an engineer who happens to be working as a mechanic, Alexandra corrected sharply. There's a difference. And he's an engineer with practical experience, and a personal stake is safety systems. She paused, her expression becoming distant. He walked into a burning building to save a stranger, Lawrence. That kind of instinct, that understanding of risk and urgency, you can't teach that in any engineering program. Reeves knew that expression. Alexandra Pierce had made up her mind, and changing it would be like trying to move a mountain with bare hands. Still, he felt compelled to treat Gunner. The board won't like bringing in an outsider on Phoenix. It's too important, too proprietary. The board works for me, not the other way around, Alexandra replied coldly, and Phoenix has been stalled for months. We need a new perspective. Before Reeves could respond, Alexandra was seized by another coughing fit, this one more severe than the last. Reeves quickly poured water from a carafe beside the bed, helping her drink when the spasm passed. Her face was paler than before, a reminder that beneath the CEO exterior was a woman who had nearly died the night before. You need to rest, Reeves said, his tone softening with genuine concern. All of this can wait until you're discharged. Alexandra waved away his concern, though she did sink back into the pillows. I want everything on Jacob Turner on my tablet before I leave the hospital. Educational records, performance reviews from Techron, anything you can find about his engineering projects, personal life, financial status, everything. Reeves nodded, knowing better than to argue further. As he turned to leave, Alexandra added, and Lawrence, find out what his son is interested in. Children are often the best way to reach their parents. After Reeves departed, Alexandra picked up a tablet and pulled up news reports about the fire. Most mentioned a local hero who had rescued the CEO of Pierce Technologies, but few had managed to get Jake's name or any details. Alexandra studied the one grainy photo a bystander had captured. A soot-stained man emerging from the building with a limp form in his arms, his face partially obscured but his posture determined. Something about the image made her pause, her finger hovering over it on the screen. Alexandra Pierce was not a woman given to sentimentality or flights of fancy. She had built her company through ruthless efficiency, strategic brilliance, and an uncanny ability to spot talent and innovation before her competitors. Yet there was something about Jacob Turner's act that resonated with her on a level she rarely acknowledged existed. She closed her eyes and immediately regretted it as the memory surfaced. Heat, smoke, terror, the crackle of flames consuming everything, a child's scream. Her hands clenched into fists on top of the blanket as she forced the images away, replacing them with plans and strategies. Jacob Turner would be an asset to Project Phoenix. That was all that mattered. Damn. The weekend passed quietly for Jake and Ethan. Saturday was spent on chores and errands, laundry, grocery shopping, fixing the loose step on the back porch. Sunday they went fishing at the reservoir, a ritual that had become sacred after Sarah's death. These peaceful hours by the water were when Ethan seemed most willing to talk and when Jake found it easiest to listen. Tommy's dad got him a new PlayStation for his birthday. Ethan mentioned casually watching his bobber float on the still water. Jake made a non-committal sound. They both knew such an expensive gift was out of the question, but neither wanted to acknowledge it directly. I told him it was cool, but I'd rather have tools like yours, Ethan continued, glancing sideways at his father. Real things that make real stuff, you know. Jake felt a surge of pride and love, so intense it nearly took his breath away. Yeah, I know, buddy. Maybe we can put together your own starter toolbox for your birthday. Nothing fancy but good quality. Tools that'll last. Ethan's face lit up. Really, like my own wrenches and everything. Sure, every man needs his own tools eventually. Jake ruffled his son's hair, a gesture that Ethan had recently begun to protest was for babies, but still secretly enjoyed. They caught 2 decent-sized bass, which Jake taught Ethan how to clean and fillet at the weathered picnic table near the shore. It was messy work, but Ethan tackled it with the same focused determination he applied to all new skills. Jake watched his son's small hands mimic his own movements, careful but confident. In these moments, he could almost convince himself that they were doing okay, that the life he was providing was enough. Monday morning arrived with the unwelcome news that Ethan's school was closed due to a water main break. Jake called Randy to explain the situation, grateful once again for his uncle's flexibility. Randy's only response was, "Bring the kid in. He can sort bolts or something." The garage was quiet for a Monday with only 2 vehicles scheduled for service. Ethan settled in a corner with a box of mixed fasteners to sort and a comic book for when he inevitably got bored. Jake lost himself in the rhythm of an oil change, the radio playing softly in the background. He was just lowering a Toyota 4Runner from the lift when Randy appeared at the bay entrance, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Jake, office, now." Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag, puzzled by Randy's tone. "Everything okay?" Randy just jerked his head toward the office and walked away. Jake glanced at Ethan, who had looked up from his comic book curiously and gave him a reassuring smile before following his uncle. The small office felt even more cramped than usual due to the presence of 3 men in dark suits standing like sentries around the room. In the center, sitting in Randy's creaky desk chair as if it were a throne, was a woman Jake recognized instantly despite having seen her only once unconscious and covered in soot. Alexandra Pierce had an undeniable presence that seemed to transform the shabby office into a mere backdrop for her commanding aura. Her tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than Jake's monthly mortgage payment, and the simple gold necklace at her throat likely represented several months' worth. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant twist, emphasizing her sharp cheekbones and penetrating eyes. The only hint of her recent ordeal was a slight hoarseness in her voice when she spoke. "Mr. Turner, thank you for making time to see me." Jake almost laughed at the formality as if he'd had any choice in the matter. Randy had retreated to the corner, looking both intimidated and fascinated by the situation unfolding in his humble domain. "Ms. Pierce," Jake acknowledged with a slight nod, "you're looking better than the last time I saw you." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Thanks to you." She gestured to the battered folding chair across from the desk. "Please sit." Jake remained standing, suddenly aware of the power dynamics at play. This was his workplace, his territory, yet he felt like a visitor. "I appreciate you coming to say thank you, but it really wasn't necessary." Alexandra studied him for a moment, her gaze coolly assessing. "Lawrence told me you didn't call. I decided a more direct approach was warranted." One of the suited men, Lawrence Reeves Jake now recognized, shifted slightly at the mention of his name. Jake noticed that while the other security personnel kept their attention on the room at large, Reeves watched only Alexandra, his vigilance personal rather than professional. "I didn't call because there was nothing to say," Jake replied evenly. "You don't owe me anything." Alexandra's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. "I disagree. I owe you my life." She opened a sleek leather portfolio on the desk, revealing documents and what appeared to be a check. I believe in settling debts promptly, Mr. Turner. Jake felt a flare of irritation. My life isn't for sale, Ms. Pierce, and neither is doing the right thing. For a brief moment, Alexandra looked genuinely taken aback, as if the concept of someone refusing her money was entirely foreign. She recovered quickly, closing the portfolio with a deliberate movement. I didn't come here to insult you. I came to offer an opportunity. Before Jake could respond, the office door opened, and Ethan slipped in curiosity, evidently having overcome his instructions to stay put. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The imposing security personnel, the elegant woman, his father's tense posture. Ethan, Jake began, a note of warning in his voice. Alexandra's demeanor changed subtly as she turned toward the boy. The cool efficiency softened into something more approachable. You must be Ethan. I'm Alexandra Pierce. Ethan moved closer to his father, suddenly shy but clearly intrigued. Are you the lady my dad saved from the fire? Alexandra nodded, holding the boy's gaze with a respect that few adults offered children. I am. Your father is a very brave man. Ethan's chest puffed out slightly with pride. He said a man takes care of people who need taking care of. That's what his dad taught him and what he's teaching me. Something in Alexandra's expression shifted, a brief vulnerability crossing her features before disappearing behind her professional mask. That's an important lesson. She glanced up at Jake, who was watching the interaction closely. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable. I'd like to discuss something with you that might be of interest. Jake hesitated, torn between curiosity and wariness. I'm working, Ms. Pierce. Some of us can't just walk away from our jobs in the middle of the day. Randy cleared his throat from the corner. Take the rest of the day, Jake. We're slow anyway. When Jake shot him a look, Randy shrugged. What? It's my shop. I can give you time off if I want. Alexandra stood, smoothing her already impeccable suit. I promise not to take too much of your time, Mr. Turner. Just lunch, perhaps, you and Ethan. The inclusion of his son in the invitation caught Jake off guard. It was a shrewd move. She'd correctly identified that he'd be less likely to refuse if it included Ethan. The question was why she was so determined to speak with him in the first place. Fine, Jake conceded finally. Lunch, but nothing fancy, all right? We're not dressed for anywhere with cloth napkins. Alexandra's smile was small but genuine. I know just the place. Just the place turned out to be a small, family-owned diner about 10 minutes from the garage. Jake was surprised by the choice. He'd expected Alexandra Pierce to suggest some upscale restaurant in the financial district, not a humble establishment known for its burgers and homemade pies. The security detail remained outside, watching the perimeter of the restaurant with professional vigilance, while Lawrence Reeves took a booth near the door, maintaining a discreet distance while keeping his employer in sight. The three of them settled into a corner booth, Ethan beside his father Alexandra, Ayashara across from them. Jake couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked in the vinyl booth, like a diamond resting on cheap velvet. Yet she seemed perfectly at ease, studying the laminated menu with the same attention she might give a corporate report. They make excellent milkshakes here, she said to Ethan, who was regarding her with undisguised curiosity. I recommend the chocolate. How do you know? Ethan asked bluntly. Do billionaires eat at diners? Ethan, Jake admonished quietly, but Alexandra laughed, the sound surprisingly warm and genuine. This particular billionaire does occasionally. I grew up not far from here, actually. My father used to bring me to this diner on Sundays after church. A shadow crossed her face briefly at the mention of her father. That was a long time ago, though. The waitress arrived to take their orders: cheeseburgers for Jake and Ethan, a garden salad for Alexandra, and chocolate milkshakes for all three. When she departed, an awkward silence fell over the table. So, Jake said finally, you mentioned an opportunity. What exactly does that mean? Alexandra folded her hands on the table, her posture shifting subtly into what Jake imagined was her boardroom demeanor. Are you familiar with Pierce Technologies, Mr. Turner? Jake shrugged. Vaguely. You make smart home system security stuff, right? Competed with Techron when I worked there. That's part of it, yes. We specialize in integrated safety and security systems for both residential and commercial applications. But our core mission is prevention rather than response. Alexandra leaned forward slightly. We don't just want to alert people when something goes wrong. We want to stop it from going wrong in the first place. Jake nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. Admirable goal. For the past 2 years, we've been developing a new fire prevention system, Project Phoenix. Alexandra watched Jake's face carefully as she continued. Unlike conventional systems that detect smoke or heat, Phoenix is designed to identify structural and electrical vulnerabilities before they cause fires. It's particularly aimed at older buildings with outdated wiring or compromised materials. Jake's interest was piqued despite himself. This was the kind of project he'd worked on in his previous life before family responsibilities and financial necessity had changed his career path. Sounds ambitious. How is it going? A flash of frustration crossed Alexandra's face. Not as well as I'd hoped. We've hit significant technical roadblocks. The system works in controlled environments, but real-world applications have been problematic. And this relates to me how exactly. Alexandra took a sip of water before answering. I want you to join the Phoenix team as a technical consultant. Your background in safety systems at Techron combined with your practical experience makes you uniquely qualified. Jake stared at her, momentarily speechless. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, a job offer hadn't been on the list. You want to hire me as an engineer? I haven't worked in that field in 5 years. Sometimes stepping away from a problem provides perspective that those immersed in it lack, Alexandra replied smoothly. And sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected sources. Jake shook his head, still processing. Ms. Pierce. Alexandra, please. Alexandra, he amended. I appreciate the offer, but I'm a mechanic now, by choice. I left that world for a reason. Because of your wife's illness, Alexandra said quietly, and your son's needs afterwards. I understand that. But circumstances change, Mr. Turner. Jake, he corrected, automatically uncomfortable with the formality when she'd requested he use her first name. Jake, she acknowledged with a slight nod, I'm offering you a position with significant flexibility. You could work primarily from home, set your own hours around Ethan's schedule. The salary would be substantially more than what you currently earn. The waitress returned with their milkshakes, providing Jake a moment to collect his thoughts. Ethan immediately began slurping his through the straw, but his eyes remained fixed on the adult's conversation. Why me? Jake asked finally. There are thousands of engineers out there with more recent experience, better credentials, who haven't spent the last 5 years changing oil and fixing transmissions. Alexandra's gaze was steady. Because you walked into a burning building when everyone else was running out. Because you understand viscerally what's at stake when safety systems fail. And because you have practical skills that most engineers lack, all right? You know how things actually work, not just how they should work in theory. Jake was surprised by the answer. It was more thoughtful than he'd expected, suggesting she'd given this serious consideration, rather than acting on a whim born of gratitude or obligation. Dad makes things in the garage, Ethan piped up suddenly. He's got a whole workshop where he invents stuff. He made a thing that beeps when our oven gets too hot and another thing that checks if the smoke detectors are working right. Alexandra's interest visibly sharpened at this information. Is that so? She asked, looking at Jake with new assessment in her eyes. Jake felt oddly exposed, as if Ethan had revealed something private. Just tinkering, nothing fancy. May I ask why you make these things? Alexandra pressed. Jake hesitated, then answered honestly. After Sarah, my wife, died, I got a bit paranoid about home safety. Couldn't afford the high-end systems, so I improvised. Basic stuff. Basic but functional, Alexandra noted. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. That's exactly the kind of thinking Phoenix needs. She pushed her salad around her plate, seemingly weighing her next words. There's something else you should know. This project is personal for me. Jake raised an eyebrow questioningly. I lost my father in a house fire when I was 12. Alexandra said, her voice carefully controlled. He went back in to try to save some family photos. The structure collapsed before he could get out. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpectedly vulnerable from this woman who exuded such confidence and control. Jake felt a sudden connection. They were both intimately familiar with loss, with the way life could change irrevocably in a moment. I'm sorry, he said simply. That's tough, especially for a kid. Alexandra acknowledged his sympathy with a slight nod. It's why I founded Pierce Technologies. Why fire prevention has always been at the core of our mission. Phoenix isn't just another product line, it's a culmination of everything we've been working toward. Jake understood now why she was pursuing him so determinedly. This wasn't just business for her, it was personal, rooted in the same kind of pain he knew all too well. Still, he had responsibilities, a life he'd carefully constructed to prioritize Ethan's needs. I need time to think about it, he said finally. This isn't a decision I can make over lunch. Of course, Alexandra agreed immediately. Take whatever time you need, but I hope you'll at least come to the research facility, see what we're working on before you decide. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they finished their meal. Alexandra asked Ethan about school, his hobbies, his friends, showing a genuine interest that the boy responded to enthusiastically. Jake watched their interaction with a mixture of surprise and wariness. Alexandra Pierce was not what he'd expected. Behind the polished exterior of the powerful CEO, he glimpsed moments of authentic warmth and unexpected depth. As they were finishing their milkshakes, Ethan excused himself to use the bathroom. Once he was out of earshot, Alexandra's demeanor became more serious. He's a remarkable boy, she said. You've done well with him, especially under difficult circumstances. Jake nodded his thanks, uncertain how to respond to the personal observation. I want to be clear about something, Jake, Alexandra continued. This isn't charity or a reward for saving me. If I didn't genuinely believe you could contribute to Phoenix, I wouldn't be offering the position regardless of what happened at the apartment building. Jake appreciated her directness, even if he wasn't entirely convinced. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why were you in that apartment that night? You don't live there. A flicker of surprise crossed Alexandra's face, quickly masked. I was meeting with a potential investor who preferred discretion. He owns a unit in the building that he uses occasionally for business meetings. The explanation made sense, yet Jake had the odd feeling she wasn't telling him everything. Before he could pursue it further, Ethan returned to the table and the moment for private conversation passed. As they prepared to leave, Alexandra handed Jake a business card with an address handwritten on the back. Our research facility. Thursday at 2 p.m., I'll make sure someone is available to give you a comprehensive tour whether I'm there or not. Jake pocketed the card without committing. I'll think about it. Outside, Lawrence Reeves held the door of a sleek black SUV as Alexandra prepared to depart. She paused before getting in, turning back to Jake. One last thing. Whatever you decide about the position, I'd like to know more about those safety devices you've created. They might be more valuable than you realize. With that enigmatic comment, she slid into the vehicle, the tinted window rising to obscure her from view. Jake watched as the SUV pulled away, followed by a second identical vehicle containing the rest of the security detail. Beside him, Ethan let out a low whistle. She's pretty cool for a billionaire, the boy observed. Are you going to take the to Dad? Jake ruffled his son's hair absently, his mind already racing with possibilities and concerns. I don't know, buddy. It's complicated. Because of Mom? Ethan asked perceptively. Because you left that kind of job when she got sick. Sometimes Jake forgot how observant his son was, how much he understood despite his young age. Partly that, yeah. And because our life is okay as it is, different isn't always better. Ethan was quiet for a moment as they walked toward their truck. But sometimes it is, he said finally. And she said you could work from home a lot. You wouldn't have to be covered in oil all the time, and maybe we could fix that leaky roof. The practical concerns of a 10-year-old, his father's appearance, their home's maintenance issues. Yet beneath those surface observations, Jake sensed his son's deeper understanding that this opportunity represented more than just a better income. It was a chance to reconnect with the part of himself that Jake had set aside when life demanded different priorities. As they drove home, Jake's mind kept returning to Project Phoenix and the glimpse he'd seen of Alexandra Pierce's genuine passion for fire prevention. Despite his reservations about her motives and the dramatic change such a position would represent, he couldn't deny that the project itself appealed to him. It aligned with his own concerns about safety, with the skills he'd once honed and still practiced in his makeshift workshop. That evening, after Ethan was in bed, Jake went out to the garage and uncovered the workbench in the corner. Unlike the organized chaos of his mechanical tools, this area was meticulously arranged. Electronic components in labeled containers, small circuit boards in various stages of completion, notebooks filled with diagrams and calculations. He picked up his most recent creation, a simple device that monitored the electrical current to major appliances and could detect as dangerous fluctuations before they caused sparks or shorts. It was crude compared to what a company like Pierce Technologies would produce, but it worked. Jake had installed similar devices in the homes of elderly neighbors, single mothers, families with young children. People who, like him, couldn't afford state-of-the-art safety systems, but deserved protection nonetheless. Jake set the device down and pulled out Alexandra's business card, turning it over in his hands thoughtfully. Perhaps there was a middle ground, a way to contribute his practical knowledge to Project Phoenix without completely upending the life he'd built for himself and Ethan. A consulting role, as Alexandra had suggested, with flexible hours and the ability to work from home. He hadn't given her an answer yet, but as he surveyed his workshop, Jake realized he was already considering how his homemade devices might be adapted and improved with Pierce Technologies' resources. The engineer in him, dormant but never truly gone, was awakening to the possibilities. The thought both excited and terrified him. Change was risky, especially when their current situation, while not ideal, was stable. Yet stagnation carried its own risks. Of missed opportunities, of regrets, of teaching Ethan to settle rather than strive. Jake had walked into a burning building without hesitation because someone needed help. Could he now find the courage to walk into a new chapter of life for the same reason? Because his knowledge might help prevent such fires in the future. Jake slipped the business card into his wallet. He hadn't decided yet, but Thursday at 2 p.m. was now a possibility he couldn't quite dismiss. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important choices came disguised as chances you never expected, like a billionaire CEO showing up at your workplace after you pulled her from a burning building. Life had a strange way of opening doors when you least expected it. The question was whether he was ready to walk through this one and what might be waiting on the other side if he did. Thursday arrived with Jake still undecided. He'd gone about his regular routine, getting Ethan to school, heading to the garage, working on the Johnson family's minivan with its perpetually misaligned front end. But Alexandra Pierce's business card sat in his wallet like a hot coal demanding attention as the hours ticked toward 2 o'clock. At noon, Jake found himself washing the perpetual grease from his hands with more thoroughness than usual. Randy watched him from across the garage, eyebrows raised. "Got a hot date or something?" Jake dried his hands, avoiding his uncle's gaze. "Just going to check out that job offer. Doesn't mean I'm taking it." Randy nodded sagely, wiping a wrench with a shop rag. "Sure, that's why you brought a clean shirt to change into." The Pierce Technologies research facility occupied a sleek glass building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by carefully landscaped grounds and a security perimeter that made Jake feel like he was entering a government installation rather than a corporate campus. At the gate, a guard checked his ID against a visitor list, then directed him to a reserved parking space near the entrance, a small detail that suggested Alexandra Pierce had been confident he would come. The lobby was a study in understated luxury, polished concrete floors, living walls of greenery, and a reception desk that appeared to be carved from a single piece of wood. The receptionist, a young man with an immaculate appearance, greeted Jake by name before he could introduce himself and asked him to wait while his escort was notified. Jake felt increasingly out of place in his clean but well-worn jeans and button-down shirt. Employees passed through the lobby in business casual attire that still managed to look expensive, carrying tablets and engaged in conversations peppered with technical jargon. This was the world he'd left behind, the corporate culture of innovation and ambition that had once been his daily reality. Before discomfort could fully settle in, Lawrence Reeves appeared from a corridor, his expression as neutral as ever. "Mr. Turner, thank you for coming. Ms. Pierce sends her regrets. An emergency board meeting required her attention. I'll be conducting your tour today." Jake felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of him had been looking forward to seeing Alexandra again, to observing how she operated in her professional environment. Another part was grateful for the chance to evaluate the facility without her persuasive presence influencing his impressions. Reeves led Jake through a series of security checkpoints, each requiring biometric authentication from the security chief. "The Phoenix Project is among our most classified initiatives," Reeves explained as they waited for an elevator. "What you'll see today is proprietary technology that our competitors would pay handsomely to access." The elevator descended rather than rising, carrying them to a subterranean level where the sleek aesthetics of the upper floors gave way to a more utilitarian design. The doors opened onto a large laboratory space filled with testing equipment, workstations, and prototypes in various stages of development. About a dozen people moved purposefully through the space, some in lab coats, others in casual business attire. A tall, slender man with prematurely graying hair broke away from a group examining a component under a magnifier and approached with obvious reluctance. Reeves made the introduction with practiced formality. Dr. Marcus Wilson, our chief engineer on Project Phoenix. Dr. Wilson, this is Jacob Turner. Wilson's handshake was perfunctory, his assessment of Jake swift and dismissive. Ah, yes, the mechanic. Ms. Pierce mentioned you might be visiting. The emphasis he placed on mechanic made it sound like a communicable disease. Jake met the engineer's gaze steadily. Former product development engineer at Techron, actually. But yes, currently a mechanic. Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, well, I suppose we should show you what we're working on since Ms. Pierce seems to think you might have something to contribute. The condescension in Wilson's tone was unmistakable. Jake had encountered the attitude before, the academic disdain for practical experience, the assumption that hands-on work somehow diminished intellectual capability. Rather than taking offense, Jake found himself curious about the source of Wilson's hostility. Was it simply professional snobbery or something more personal? Wilson led them to a central workstation where a complex schematic was displayed on a large screen. Project Phoenix is attempting something unprecedented in fire prevention technology. Rather than merely detecting fire once it starts, our system identifies conditions that precede ignition. But despite Wilson's attitude, Jake found himself drawn into the technical explanation that followed. The engineer outlined a system that used a network of sensors to monitor not just temperature and smoke, but electrical current fluctuations, structural stress points, and material degradation. In theory, it could predict potential fire hazards days or even weeks before they became dangerous. The concept is sound, Wilson concluded, but implementation has proven challenging, particularly in older structures with non-standard materials and wiring. Jake studied the schematic, noting points where theory might conflict with real-world conditions. Have you field tested in actual older buildings or just lab simulations? Wilson's expression tightened. We've run extensive simulations. Field testing is the next phase once we resolve the current technical issues. Which are, Jake pressed. Wilson hesitated, glancing at Reeves, who nodded slightly. False positives primarily. The system is too sensitive, flagging normal variations as potential hazards. And in some cases, it fails to detect actual dangers until they're already critical. Jake moved closer to the schematic, pointing to a particular sensor configuration. Your moisture detection is interfering with the electrical monitoring here, and these sensitivity thresholds are probably calibrated to new construction standards, not the quirks of older buildings. Wilson's surprise quickly transformed into defensive irritation. That's a vast oversimplification of extremely complex engineering challenges. Jake shrugged, unperturbed. Sometimes complex problems have simple components. I worked with similar issues at Techron. Wilson's retort was interrupted by the arrival of a petite woman with close-cropped hair and an air of focused energy. She extended her hand to Jake with a warm smile. Dr. Elaine Chen, materials specialist. You must be the famous Jacob Turner we've been hearing about. Jake accepted her handshake, puzzled. Famous, Elaine laughed. The man who saved our CEO from a burning building and who apparently has Marcus worried about his position. She winked at Wilson, who scowled in response. The next hour was spent touring the lab with Elaine taking over as guide. Unlike Wilson, she seemed genuinely interested in Jake's background and perspectives, asking thoughtful questions about his experience at Techron and even his observations as a mechanic. Wilson trailed behind them, occasionally interjecting technical corrections or clarifications, his discomfort growing more evident as Jake engaged intelligently with the material. The tour culminated at a testing chamber where a full-scale apartment mock-up had been constructed, complete with typical furnishings and fixtures. Elaine explained that they used the chamber to simulate various fire scenarios and test the Phoenix system's effectiveness. We can control every variable: temperature, humidity, electrical current, even the composition of the air, she said proudly. It's as close as we can get to real-world conditions in a laboratory setting. Jake walked through the mock-up, noting details that seemed either too perfect or not authentic enough. compared to actual lived-in spaces. People are messy, he observed. They hang pictures with too many nails, overload outlets, with power strips block ventilation with furniture. Have you accounted for human behavior in your testing? Wilson made a sound of exasperation. We're engineers, not sociologists. We design for optimal conditions and build in safety margins for suboptimal use. Jake stopped beside an electrical panel, considering his words carefully. With all due respect, Dr. Wilson, fires don't happen under optimal conditions. They happen when multiple things go wrong simultaneously, often because of exactly the kind of human behavior you're not testing for. The tension between them was broken by a soft chime from Reeves' phone. He checked the message, then addressed the group. Ms. Pierce has concluded her meeting and would like to speak with Mr. Turner in her office. Wilson's relief at ending the tour was palpable. Elaine, by contrast, shook Jake's hand warmly. I hope you'll consider joining us, Mr. Turner. We could use your perspective. As Reeves led Jake back to the elevator, Jake glanced over his shoulder at Wilson, who was already huddled with several team members gesturing animatedly. I don't think Dr. Wilson shares your enthusiasm. Reeves's expression remained neutral as the elevator doors closed. Dr. Wilson is protective of his project. He's been leading Phoenix for 2 years, and progress has been slower than anticipated. Jake recognized the diplomatic phrasing for what it was. Wilson was failing to deliver, and Alexandra Pierce was looking for alternatives. No wonder the man had reacted so defensively to Jake's visit. The executive level of Pierce Technologies contrasted sharply with the laboratory below. Here the aesthetic was warm minimalism, natural wood soft lighting and views of the surrounding landscape through floor-to-ceiling windows. Reeves guided Jake to a corner office where Alexandra Pierce stood at a standing desk reviewing documents on multiple screens. She looked up as they entered, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Jake, thank you for coming. I trust Lawrence has shown you everything. Her voice still carried the slight hoarseness from smoke inhalation, a reminder of their unusual first meeting. Reeves excused himself discreetly as Jake moved into the office. He has. It's an impressive operation. Alexandra gestured to a seating area with comfortable chairs arranged around a low table. As they sat, Jake noticed that despite the office's luxury, it contained few personal touches. No family photos, no mementos, only a small sculpture that appeared to be made of twisted metal salvaged from a fire. What did you think of Phoenix? Alexandra asked, her gaze direct and evaluating. Jake considered his response carefully. The concept is revolutionary. The execution has problems. Alexandra nodded, unsurprised by his assessment. Specifics. Your team is approaching it too theoretically. They're building a system for buildings as they should be, not as they actually exist. Jake leaned forward, warming to the topic despite himself. And they're focusing on the wrong metrics. A system that generates frequent false positives will just be disabled by users. Better to catch 80% of real problems reliably than to aim for 100% and create alert fatigue. Alexandra watched him with increasing interest as he outlined his observations. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment, then asked, "What would you do differently?" The question caught Jake off guard. He'd come to observe, not to propose solutions. Yet ideas had been forming since he'd first seen the schematics. I'd simplify, focus on the most common fire causes first. Electrical faults, cooking accidents, heating system failures. Perfect those detections before expanding to more exotic scenarios. Alexandra nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. And the false positive issue, Jake gestured with his hands as he worked through the problem aloud. Adaptive thresholds based on building age and type. Machine learning algorithms that adjust sensitivity based on patterns of use. And most importantly, real-world testing in actual buildings, not just lab simulations. A smile played at the corners of Alexandra's mouth. You've given this substantial thought for someone who hasn't decided whether to join the project. Jake felt a flush of embarrassment. Force of habit. I spent 8 years solving these kinds of problems. Alexandra rose and moved to a small kitchenette concealed in the wall. Coffee or something stronger? I think we've reached the portion of this conversation where refreshments are appropriate. Jake opted for coffee watching as she prepared 2 cups with the focused precision she seemed to bring to every task. When she returned and handed him a mug, their fingers brushed briefly. An unexpected current of awareness passed between them, catching them both by surprise. Alexandra recovered first, settling back into her chair. I'd like to make you a formal offer, Jake. Technical consultant to Project Phoenix with flexible hours and the option to work primarily from home. You'd need to come to the lab for team meetings and testing phases, but most of your work could be done remotely. She named a salary that made Jake blink, nearly 3 times what he currently earned at the garage. That's generous. It's market rate for your expertise plus a premium for the unique perspective you bring. Alexandra sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of the mug. You're not convinced. It wasn't a question, but Jake answered anyway. I've spent 5 years building a life that works for Ethan. Predictable schedule, stability, no work following me home at night. This would change all of that. Alexandra set her coffee down. Change isn't necessarily negative. You'd have financial security, intellectual stimulation, the chance to create something that could save countless lives, including children like Ethan. The reference to his son was deliberate, Jake knew, a reminder of the human stakes behind the technical challenge. Still, her words resonated with the part of him that had always found meaning in his engineering work, the satisfaction of solving problems that mattered. I need to think about it, Jake said finally. Talk to Ethan. Alexandra nodded, accepting his hesitation. Of course, but I should mention that time is a factor. The board is becoming impatient with Phoenix's progress. If we can't demonstrate significant improvement in the next quarter, they're considering selling the technology to Safeguard Systems. Jake recognized the name. One of the largest security companies in the country, known more for aggressive marketing than innovation. They'd shelve it if it competed with their existing products. Precisely. Alexander's expression hardened momentarily. I didn't build Pierce Technologies to create drawer technology. Either we make Phoenix work or we let it die properly by releasing it to the public domain. I won't let it be buried by corporate politics. The vehemence in her voice surprised Jake. This wasn't just business for her. It was personal, connected to the loss she'd mentioned. For the first time, he wondered if there was more to her story than she'd shared. Their conversation was interrupted by Reeves, who entered after a discreet knock. Ms. Pierce, your 4 o'clock is waiting, and Dr. Wilson has requested a moment regarding today's visit. Alexandra's slight emphasis on requested suggested Wilson was being insistent rather than patient. She sighed almost imperceptibly, then turned to Jake. I need to attend to this. Lawrence will show you out. Please consider my offer, Jake. Phoenix needs someone who understands both the engineering and the human element. As Jake followed Reeves through the executive floor, they passed a conference room with glass walls. Inside, Marcus Wilson was pacing, his body language communicating agitation. When he spotted Jake, he stopped abruptly, his expression darkening. Jake lifted a hand in acknowledgement, receiving only a cold stare in return. Dr. Wilson seems concerned about my presence, Jake observed as they continued toward the elevator. Reeves' response was measured. Dr. Wilson is protective of his position. Your background at Techron makes you a potential threat in his eyes. Jake shook his head. I'm not looking to take anyone's job. Perhaps not intentionally. Reeves pressed the elevator call button. But Ms. Pierce has a history of recognizing talent and promoting it rapidly. Dr. Wilson is aware of this tendency. The implication was clear. Alexandra saw something in Jake that she valued potentially more than Wilson's expertise. It was flattering but also concerning. Jake hadn't come here to get caught in corporate politics or to displace someone who had invested years in the project. As the elevator descended, Jake reflected on everything he'd seen. The Phoenix technology was genuinely innovative, addressing a problem he cared about deeply. The work would be challenging and meaningful, the compensation more than generous. Yet something held him back. Not just concern for how it would affect Ethan, but a nagging sense that there were pieces to this situation he wasn't seeing clearly. When Jake arrived home, he found Ethan at the kitchen table working on homework, supervised by Mrs. Delaney from next door, who occasionally watched him after school. She departed with her usual cheerful efficiency, leaving father and son to their evening routine. How was the science place? Ethan asked, pushing aside his math workbook. Did they have robots and stuff? Jake smiled at his son's conception of a research facility. No robots, lots of computers and testing equipment. They're working on a system to prevent fires before they start. Ethan's eyes widened with interest. Like your inventions in the garage, but fancier. Much fancier, Jake confirmed, beginning to prepare dinner. And they want me to help them with it. Ethan abandoned any pretense of returning to his homework. Are you going to? Would you wear a lab coat? Would you still work at Uncle Randy's? The rapid-fire questions reflected both excitement and anxiety. Ethan had adapted to their life as it was finding security in its routines. Change, even potentially positive change, carried uncertainty. Jake chose his words carefully. I haven't decided yet. If I took the trial, I'd mostly work from home. I'd earn more money, but my schedule might be less predictable sometimes. Ethan absorbed this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. Would you be happier? You always seem happier when you're making things in the garage than when you're fixing cars. The observation struck Jake silent for a moment. He hadn't realized his son was so perceptive that Ethan had noticed the difference between his professional work and his personal projects. The question forced him to acknowledge a truth he'd been avoiding. He did miss engineering, the creative problem-solving, and the sense of contributing to something larger than himself. Maybe, Jake admitted finally, but what matters most is what works for both of us. Ethan nodded solemnly, then brightened. If you make more money, can we fix the roof and get new sneakers? Tommy got Jordans for his birthday. Jake laughed, ruffling his son's hair. One step at a time, buddy. First, I have to decide if this job is right for us. Later that night, after Ethan was asleep, Jake retreated to his garage workshop. He pulled out the proposal Alexandra had sent home with him, reviewing the details of the position. The terms were generous, the expectations clear. What wasn't clear were Alexandra's true motivations. Why was she so determined to bring him onto the project? His experience was relevant, but dated his formal credentials unremarkable compared to someone like Wilson. The obvious explanation, gratitude for saving her life, didn't fully satisfy. Alexandra Pierce didn't strike him as someone who made business decisions based on personal sentiment. Jake set aside the proposal and turned to his current project, a simple device that monitored electrical resistance in wiring, alerting homeowners to potential hazards before they became dangerous. It was crude compared to Phoenix's sophisticated system, but it worked reliably and cost a fraction to produce. As he tinkered, Jake's mind drifted back to Alexandra. There was something compelling about her beyond her obvious beauty and intelligence, a driving purpose that seemed to fuel her every action. The personal connection to fire prevention through her father's death explained part of it, but Jake sensed there was more to the story than she'd revealed. His phone chimed with a text message. Jake was surprised to see Alexandra's name on the screen. Hope your drive home was smooth. Just left a contentious meeting with Dr. Wilson. He's convinced you're being brought in to replace him. I assured him that's not the case, but perhaps you could reassure him yourself. If you accept the position, I value his expertise, but need his cooperation. The message was professional, yet personal, acknowledging the tension Jake had observed while offering a potential solution. He appreciated her directness, the lack of manipulation in her approach. After a moment's consideration, he replied, Wilson's concerns are understandable. If I accept, I'll make it clear I'm there to complement the team, not replace anyone. Still considering the offer. Her response came quickly. Fair enough. No pressure, but the sooner you decide, the sooner we can address these dynamics. Sleep well, Jake. The exchange left Jake feeling both more settled and more confused about the potential position. Alexandra was clearly a thoughtful leader who recognized the human complexities of her organization. Yet the urgency behind her recruitment efforts remained puzzling. The weekend arrived without Jake having reached a decision. He took Ethan fishing at their usual spot, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. As they sat side by side on the dock lines cast into the still water, Jake broached the subject that had been dominating his thoughts. I'm thinking about taking that job, he said, watching his son's face carefully. Not full-time, but as consultant. I could still be home when you get back from school most days. Ethan nodded, unusually serious. I think you should. You like fixing things that matter. The simple observation cut to the heart of Jake's internal debate. He did want to work on problems that mattered, to use his skills for something more meaningful than routine car maintenance. But he'd prioritize stability and presence in Ethan's life above professional fulfillment, a trade-off he'd never regretted. Things would change, Jake warned. I'd have to go to meetings sometimes, maybe travel occasionally. Ethan shrugged his attention, apparently on his fishing line. Mom always said change is just life happening. Remember. The unexpected reference to Sarah caught Jake off guard. Ethan rarely mentioned his mother unprompted, though her photos remain prominently displayed in their home. She did say that, Jake agreed softly. Besides, Ethan continued with practical certainty, Mrs. Delaney said she'd watch me any time. And I'm not a baby. I'm almost 11. Jake smiled at his son's assertion of near adulthood. Almost 11, huh? Practically ready for college. Ethan rolled his eyes in the universal expression of preteen exasperation. Dad, I'm serious. You should take the job. The fire lady needs your help. Alexandra? Jake corrected automatically. Her name is Alexandra Pierce. Ethan nodded sagely. She looks at you funny, like Melissa's mom looks at her new boyfriend. Jake nearly dropped his fishing pole. What? No, buddy, it's not like that. This is just a job offer. Ethan shrugged again, the matter settled in his mind. If you say so, can we get ice cream on the way home? The abrupt change of subject was typical of Ethan's age, but Jake remained unsettled by his son's observation. Had Alexandra been looking at him differently, and had he been looking back, the thought was both unsettling and intriguing. Alexandra Pierce was undeniably attractive, intelligent, and compelling. Under other circumstances, Jake might have been interested. But as a potential employer, she was firmly in the category of professional association, not personal. Monday morning found Jake at Pierce Technologies once again, this time with his decision made. Alexandra greeted him in the lobby herself, foregoing the formality of having Reeves escort him. She led him not to her office, but to a small conference room where a contract awaited. I've reviewed your suggestions and incorporated them into the terms, she explained, as Jake scanned the document. 6-month initial commitment option to extend based on mutual agreement. 3 days per week, only one of which requires on-site presence. The salary remains as discussed. Jake was impressed by the flexibility she'd built into the arrangement, clearly designed to address his concerns about balancing work with Ethan's needs. This looks fair, but before I sign, I want to be clear about my role. I'm not here to replace Wilson or take over the project. I'm here to contribute a different perspective. Alexandra nodded, her expression serious. Absolutely. Marcus is brilliant, but sometimes too theoretical. You bring practical experience and a user-centered mindset we desperately need. Ideally, your contributions will complement his expertise, not compete with it. Jake appreciated her candor. With his main concerns addressed, he signed the contract, committing himself to Project Phoenix for at least the next 6 months. As Alexandra added her signature beside his, Jake couldn't help but notice the careful precision of her movements, the subtle scent of her perfume. Ethan's comment about looking funny flashed through his mind, and he quickly refocused on the business at hand. When would you like me to start? Jake asked, pushing the signed contract across the table. Today, if possible, Alexandra replied. The team is gathering this afternoon to review the latest test results. Your insights would be valuable. Jake hesitated, thinking of his obligations at the garage. I should talk to my uncle first, give him proper notice. Alexandra nodded, understanding. Of course. How about Wednesday? That gives you time to transition your current work. They agreed on the start date, and Alexandra walked Jake back to the lobby. As they reached the entrance, she paused. Thank you, Jake, for taking this chance. I believe Phoenix will be better for your involvement. There was a sincerity in her words that resonated with Jake, making him more confident in his decision. I hope I can live up to your expectations. Alexandra's smile was warm. You already have in ways you don't yet understand. The cryptic comment lingered in Jake's mind as he drove to the garage to break the news to Randy. His uncle received the information with mixed emotions. Pride in Jake's opportunity, concern about losing his best mechanic, and thinly veiled curiosity about the fancy lady boss. Just don't forget where you came from, Randy advised, as they discussed which of Jake's current projects could be reassigned. Those corporate types live in a different world. Jake assured his uncle that he wouldn't be abandoning the garage entirely. He'd still be available for consultation on difficult repairs and planned to keep his hand in by working occasional Saturdays. The arrangement satisfied Randy, who clapped Jake on the shoulder with gruff affection. Sarah would be proud, Randy said, the rare mention of Jake's late wife carrying significant emotional weight. She always said you were wasting your big brain changing oil filters. The comment stayed with Jake throughout the day as he worked through his remaining repairs. Sarah had indeed encouraged him to pursue challenging engineering problems, to use his creativity and intelligence to make a difference. She'd been supportive when he left Techron to care for her and Ethan, but had made him promise not to give up his professional aspirations forever. Perhaps this opportunity with Pierce Technologies was in some way fulfilling that promise. The thought brought both comfort and a renewed sense of purpose as Jake prepared for this unexpected new chapter in his career. Wednesday arrived with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Jake dressed more carefully than usual, selecting clothes that bridged the gap between the casual environment of the garage and the professional atmosphere of Pierce Technologies. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt, and a sport coat he hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral. Ethan noticed the change immediately at breakfast. "You look different, more like when Mom was alive." The observation struck Jake silent for a moment. He hadn't made the connection himself, but Ethan was right. This was how he had dressed for his engineering job before circumstances had changed their lives. Jake dropped Ethan at school with a longer than usual hug, then drove to Pierce Technologies with a strange sense of returning to something rather than beginning something new. The security guard at the gate recognized him, waving him through to the now familiar parking area reserved for executives and special visitors. In the lobby, Lawrence Reeves awaited him with an access badge and a tablet. "Your security clearance has been processed. This badge gives you access to the Phoenix lab and common areas. The tablet is connected to our secure network for project materials." The efficiency with which his integration had been arranged suggested Alexandra had been confident of his acceptance all along. Jake wasn't sure whether to find that presumptuous or flattering. Reeves escorted him to the laboratory level where the Phoenix team was gathering for their meeting. As they entered, conversations hushed, all eyes turning to assess the newcomer. Jake recognized Elaine Chen, who offered a welcoming smile, and Marcus Wilson, whose expression remained coldly neutral. Alexandra stood at the head of the conference table, commanding attention without obvious effort. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, Jacob Turner has joined Project Phoenix as a technical consultant. Jake brings valuable experience from Techron systems in a practical perspective that will complement our existing expertise. I expect everyone to extend him full cooperation and access to project materials." The introduction was professional and straightforward, establishing Jake's legitimacy while acknowledging the team's existing contributions. Jake appreciated Alexandra's approach. She was neither undermining Wilson's authority nor overselling Jake's importance. As Jake took a seat, Alexandra continued the meeting, reviewing recent test results with incisive questions that revealed both her technical knowledge and her strategic vision for the project. Jake observed the team dynamics carefully, noting who spoke confidently, who deferred to others who seemed resistant to certain ideas. Wilson dominated the technical discussion, his expertise evident despite his defensive posture. Elaine contributed valuable insights on materials science, while other team members specialized in software, electrical engineering, and regulatory compliance. They were undeniably brilliant individuals, but Jake noticed a tendency toward theoretical solutions and a dismissal of practical limitations. When Alexandra invited his input, Jake spoke carefully, framing his observations as questions rather than criticisms. "Have we considered how these sensors would perform in buildings with outdated wiring, or how users might respond to the interface during high-stress situations?" His approach seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Several team members engaged thoughtfully with his questions, while Wilson remained skeptically silent. By the meeting's end, Jake had identified several areas where his experience might genuinely contribute to the project's advancement. As the team dispersed to their various workstations, Alexandra motioned for Jake to remain behind. When they were alone, her professional demeanor softened slightly. "That went better than I expected. You handled Wilson's territorial behavior well." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with discussing a colleague's attitude. "He's invested in this project. It's natural to be protective." Alexandra studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see more than Jake intended to reveal. Most people would be more concerned with establishing their own credibility than defending someone who's clearly hostile. "I'm not here to make enemies or play office politics," Jake said simply. "I'm here to help make Phoenix work." Something in Alexandra's expression shifted. Approval, perhaps, or confirmation of a judgment already made. "That's precisely why you're here, Jake. Not just for your technical skills, but for your character." The comment felt too personal, crossing the line between professional and private assessment, and Jake redirected the conversation to safer territory. I'd like to review the testing protocols and the most recent prototype specifications if that's possible. Alexandra accepted the shift, gracefully arranging for Jake to have a temporary workspace and access to the project archives. As she left him to his research, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his recruitment than Alexandra had revealed. Some purpose beyond his technical contributions or her gratitude for the rescue. The rest of the day passed in a blur of technical documentation, introductions to team members, and orientation to Pierce Technologies' systems and protocols. By late afternoon, Jake's head was swimming with new information, but he'd begun to form a clearer picture of Project Phoenix's current state and challenges. As Jake prepared to leave, planning to arrive at Ethan's school in time for pickup, he encountered Wilson in the elevator lobby. The chief engineer regarded him with barely concealed resentment. Jake decided direct address was better than awkward avoidance. "Dr. Wilson, I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to undermine your position or take credit for your work. I respect what you've accomplished with Phoenix." Wilson's expression remained guarded. "Yet Ms. Pierce clearly believes you have something to contribute that I don't. Something worth a consultant's salary and special access." Jake considered his response carefully. "Different perspectives often lead to better solutions. My experience is complementary to yours, not superior." Wilson seemed unmoved by the diplomatic response. "Let me be direct, Turner. I've spent 2 years on this project. It's my design, my vision. I won't have it compromised by shortcuts or practical solutions that undermine its integrity." The emphasis on practical made it sound like a character flaw rather than a valuable approach. Before Jake could respond, Wilson continued, his voice lowering. "And I'd be careful about Pierce's special interest in you. She has a history of elevating people who serve her purposes, then discarding them when they're no longer useful." The warning carried an undercurrent of personal experience that caught Jake's attention. Had Wilson himself been one of those elevated, then discarded? Before he could probe further, the elevator arrived and Wilson stepped inside without another word, leaving Jake to consider this new perspective on Alexandra Pierce in his role at Pierce Technologies. Jake settled into a rhythm at Pierce Technologies over several weeks, finding his balance between the lab and his continued part-time work at Randy's garage. The transition had been smoother than expected. Randy had hired a young mechanic to cover most of Jake's shifts, keeping a position open for Jake on Saturdays. At Pierce, the initial tension with the Phoenix team had begun to ease as Jake's modifications to the sensor calibration algorithms showed promising results in testing. Marcus Wilson remained professionally reserved, but his outright hostility had softened to grudging respect. During technical discussions, he'd begun to acknowledge Jake's input without the dismissive tone that had characterized their early interactions. Turner's suggestion about the adaptive thresholds might actually work, he'd admitted during a recent team meeting, the closest thing to a compliment Jake had received from the chief engineer. Alexandra maintained a careful professional distance, communicating primarily through project channels and team meetings. Occasionally, Jake would catch her watching him with that evaluative gaze that seemed to look past technical concerns to something deeper, but she never crossed the line into personal territory. The restraint puzzled him. There had been moments of genuine connection between them, yet she seemed determined to keep their relationship strictly professional. At home, Jake had converted a corner of the dining room into a remote workspace, allowing him to review schematics and run simulations while remaining present for Ethan's after-school routine. The arrangement worked, though not without challenges. Several times, Jake had found himself explaining complex technical concepts to his son while making dinner, Ethan's questions surprisingly insightful for a 10-year-old. "So the sensors can tell if a fire is going to happen before it actually does?" Ethan had asked one evening, peering over Jake's shoulder at the tablet display. "That's the idea," Jake had explained, "like how you can smell when the toast is about to burn, but way more advanced." Ethan had considered this analogy seriously, but sometimes the toaster just burns stuff anyway, even when you're watching it. The observation had made Jake smile, but it also captured the fundamental challenge of Project Phoenix predicting the unpredictable, distinguishing between normal variations and genuine warning signs. The more Jake delved into the project's technical specifications, the more he recognized both its revolutionary potential and its persistent flaws. On a Thursday afternoon, as Jake was preparing to leave the lab, Alexandra appeared at his workstation. Unlike her usual corporate attire, she wore jeans and a casual blazer that subtly transformed her from CEO to simply a woman with intelligent eyes and a guarded smile. Do you have a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss privately. Jake checked his watch still an hour before he needed to pick up Ethan from his after-school program. Sure. Rather than leading him to her office or a conference room, Alexandra guided him to the parking garage. I thought we might talk somewhere less monitored. She indicated her personal vehicle, a surprisingly modest electric sedan, rather than the luxury SUV her security team used. There's a coffee shop about 10 minutes from here. We can speak freely there. The unusual request raised Jake's curiosity and caution simultaneously. What could be so sensitive it couldn't be discussed within Pierce Technologies' walls? He followed in his own truck, considering possibilities from corporate espionage to concerns about Wilson's continued resistance to his input. The coffee shop occupied the ground floor of a renovated industrial building, its brick walls and exposed beams creating an atmosphere of casual authenticity. Alexandra chose a corner table away from other customers, ordering a simple black coffee while Jake selected green tea. When they were settled, she got directly to the point. I haven't been entirely forthcoming about Project Phoenix, Jake, or about why I wanted you specifically involved. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, a rare sign of hesitation from a woman who typically projected absolute certainty. There are aspects of the situation I couldn't discuss in the office where certain people might overhear. Jake's wariness increased. What kind of aspects? Alexandra met his gaze directly. I believe someone at Pierce Technologies is deliberately sabotaging Phoenix, and I think they're doing it on behalf of safeguard systems. The accusation hung between them serious enough to end careers or even trigger criminal charges. Jake processed the implications carefully. That's a significant claim. What evidence do you have? Pattern recognition primarily. Key test failures that shouldn't have occurred. Missing data, prototype components that malfunction despite passing quality checks. Alexandra's voice remained steady, but intensity burned beneath her controlled exterior. And twice in the past year, Safeguard has announced products that bear striking similarities to proprietary Pierce technologies that never made it to market. Jake considered this information, mentally reviewing the project's setbacks he'd observed. And you suspect Wilson? Alexander's expression tightened slightly. I don't want to suspect him. Marcus has been with the company for 5 years and he's brilliant. But he's also ambitious, frustrated with what he perceives as lack of recognition, and he had exclusive access to the project components that failed most suspiciously. The pieces aligned with Wilson's initial hostility and his cryptic warning about Alexandra's tendency to discard people. If he felt undervalued or passed over for advancement, resentment could have festered into something darker. Why bring me in? Why not just fire him if you suspect he's compromised? Because suspicion isn't proof. And because firing him without evidence would potentially give him grounds for a wrongful termination suit during which he could demand access to all Phoenix documentation for his defense. Alexandra sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. I needed someone outside the existing power structures, someone with the technical expertise to evaluate the project objectively and potentially identify deliberate sabotage versus honest mistakes. Jake felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. So I'm not here for my practical experience or unique perspective. I'm here to be your spion. Alexandra flinched visibly at the accusation. No, you're here because you have precisely the expertise Phoenix needs. That's not a cover story, it's the absolute truth. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. But yes, I also hoped your outsider position would allow you to see things others might miss or be complicit in hiding. The dual purpose of his hiring left Jake conflicted. On one hand, he resented being used as an unwitting investigator. On the other, if someone was deliberately undermining technology that could save lives, didn't he have an obligation to help expose that betrayal? What exactly are you asking me to do? Jake kept his tone neutral, withholding judgment until he understood the full request. Nothing unethical. Just be vigilant. Document inconsistencies. Question processes that don't make sense. Alexandra's intensity softened slightly. I brought you on to Phoenix because I genuinely believe in your abilities, Jake. The investigation aspect is secondary, though vital. Jake weighed his options carefully. Walking away would be the simplest choice, returning to his uncomplicated life at the garage free from corporate intrigue. But abandoning Phoenix meant giving up on technology that aligned with his deepest values, technology that could prevent tragedies like those that had shaped both his and Alexandra's lives. I'll keep my eyes open, Jake conceded finally. But I won't actively spy on my colleagues or set traps. That's not who I am. Relief visibly washed over Alexandra. That's all I'm asking. Your integrity is precisely why I trust you with this. She hesitated, then added, there's something else you should know. Something personal that may help explain why this matters so much to me. Jake waited, sensing they were approaching a deeper truth behind Alexandra's intense commitment to Phoenix. Remember when I told you about losing my father in that fire when I was 12? How he went back in for family photographs? Alexandra's voice grew quieter, forcing Jake to lean closer to hear. That was the simplified version. The truth is more complicated. Jake nodded, encouraging her to continue without pushing. The fire wasn't entirely accidental. Her knuckles whitened around her coffee mug. My father had been struggling financially for years. The business was failing, debts piling up. She paused, gathering herself. He thought he saw a way out. The insurance policy on our house had recently been increased. The implication hung in the air between them. Jake felt a chill, despite the coffee shop's warmth. He started the fire. Alexandra nodded once sharply. He didn't know I'd come home early from a friend's house. When he realized I was inside, he did try to get me out. That part is true, but the fire spread faster than he anticipated, and she didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake could fill in the rest, the father trapped by his own desperate scheme, the daughter scarred by both the loss and the betrayal. The insurance company investigated and denied the claim. My mother and I were left with nothing but debt and shame. She drank herself to death within 3 years. A bitter smile twisted Alexandra's lips. The official story became that my heroic father died trying to save family photographs. People prefer palatable lies to ugly truths. Jake struggled to reconcile this tragic background with the powerful, composed woman before him. How did you go from that to... He gestured vaguely, encompassing her current success, foster care, scholarships, relentless determination never to be vulnerable again. Alexandra's expression hardened with remembered pain. And a promise I made standing in the ashes of that house, that I would dedicate my life to preventing others from experiencing what I did. Not just the fire itself, but the devastating aftermath when safety systems fail. The personal stakes behind Phoenix suddenly became crystal clear. This wasn't just a corporate project or even a public safety initiative. It was Alexandra's redemption, her attempt to transform her father's destructive legacy into something protective and life-affirming. Jake reached across the table, impulsively covering her hand with his own. I understand now, and I'll help Alexandra. Not just with the technical challenges, but with finding the truth, whatever it is. Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection forged through shared understanding of how personal loss could drive professional purpose. Alexandra turned her hand beneath his, their fingers briefly interlacing before she withdrew, composure reasserting itself. Thank you. The simple acknowledgement carried weight beyond the words themselves. Alexandra glanced at her watch and straightened. You should go get Ethan. We can discuss specific concerns I have about recent test failures tomorrow. As Jake drove to Ethan's school, his mind churned with everything Alexandra had revealed. The personal tragedy explaining her commitment to Phoenix. The suspected sabotage threatening the project. The complex motivations behind his hiring. And beneath it all, the undeniable personal connection growing between them despite professional boundaries. Later that evening, after Ethan was asleep, Jake sat in his garage workshop reviewing Phoenix documentation on his secure tablet. With Alexandra's suspicions in mind, he examined recent test failure reports with fresh scrutiny. Several anomalies emerged, components failing in ways inconsistent with their design specifications, data logs showing gaps during critical testing periods, prototype adjustments made without proper documentation. None of these issues definitively prove sabotage, rather than incompetence or bad luck. But collectively, they painted a troubling picture, especially when mapped against product announcements from safeguard systems. Jake also found himself searching for information about Pierce Technologies and its founder. Public records and business profiles painted Alexandra as a brilliant innovator who had built her company from nothing after graduating from MIT. There were mentions of her orphan status, but no details about her parents' deaths. She had carefully controlled her narrative, revealing her true background only to those she trusted completely. His search eventually led him to archived newspaper articles about the fire. The reports mentioned arson investigations, but were inconclusive about the cause. Insurance companies had denied claims citing suspicious circumstances, but criminal charges were never filed against Alexandra's father. His death had effectively closed the case. Reading between the lines, Jake could see how a 12-year-old girl had become collateral damage in a desperate man's failed scheme. The next morning, Jake arrived at Pierce Technologies earlier than usual, hoping to access the Phoenix prototypes before the full team assembled. To his surprise, he found Elaine Chen already in the lab examining circuit boards under a microscope. She looked up at his entrance, dark circles under her eyes suggesting a long night. "Jake, you're here early." Jake set down his bag casually, keeping his tone light. "Wanted to get a jump on the sensor calibration issue. Didn't expect anyone else to beat me in." Elaine's smile held exhaustion. "Been here all night, actually. Something's not adding up with the materials testing, and it's driving me crazy." Her frustration seemed genuine, and Jake saw an opportunity to gain an ally in his investigation. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Elaine sighed, pushing away from the microscope. "The heat-resistant polymer we're using for the sensor housing is showing degradation patterns it shouldn't exhibit at the test temperatures. I've run the analysis 3 times, and the results make no sense unless—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Jake completed her thought. "Unless someone is tampering with either the samples or the testing equipment." Their eyes met in silent acknowledgement of the implication. Elaine glanced toward the lab's security cameras, then gestured for Jake to follow her into the materials storage room, one of the few areas without video monitoring due to its limited access. Once inside, she spoke in a hushed tone. "I've suspected something wasn't right for months. Components that passed quality control failing during integration. Test results that contradict established material science." Her expression hardened with professional indignation. "At first I thought it was just bad luck or my own mistakes. Now I'm certain it's deliberate." Jake weighed his options carefully before deciding to trust Elaine with a partial confidence. "Alexandra has similar concerns. Have you noticed anyone with unusual access or interest in these components? Wilson, perhaps?" Elaine's brow furrowed. "Marcus, I don't think he's behind this. He's arrogant and territorial, but he's passionate about Phoenix succeeding." She hesitated, lowering her voice further. "If you're looking for suspicious behavior, I'd consider Lawrence Reeves." The suggestion caught Jake completely off guard. "Alexandra's head of security. Why would he sabotage her flagship project?" "I don't know his motivations, but I've seen him in the lab during off hours accessing areas that have nothing to do with security protocols." Elaine's expression reflected her unease. "And 3 times now I've noticed materials or components moved or altered after he's been present." The accusation against Reeves complicated matters significantly. If Alexandra's most trusted security officer was compromised, who could they safely bring their concerns to? Jake decided to proceed cautiously, gathering more evidence before confronting Alexandra with these new suspicions. "Keep documenting everything unusual you observe," Jake advised Elaine. "But don't confront Reeves or mention your concerns to anyone else yet, not even Alexandra. We need irrefutable proof before making accusations of this magnitude." Over the next 2 weeks, Jake and Elaine developed a system for monitoring the Phoenix lab and tracking access to critical components. They staggered their work hours to maintain broader coverage, implemented subtle markers on test materials to detect tampering, and created a private communication channel outside the Pierce Technologies network. During this time, Jake continued his regular routine, splitting time between the lab and the garage, maintaining Ethan's school and extracurricular schedule, joining the weekend fishing trips that had become their sacred ritual. He was careful to keep his investigations separate from his home life, not wanting to burden Ethan with adult concerns. Yet one evening, as Jake was reviewing Phoenix schematics at the dining table, Ethan surprised him with an unexpected observation. "Dad, is your fire thing going to help people like Mrs. Rodriguez?" Jake looked up, momentarily confused. Mrs. Rodriguez was their elderly neighbor, whose kitchen had caught fire the previous year. "What made you think of that?" Ethan shrugged, the gesture deceptively casual. "You're always working on it, and you get this look, the same one you had when you were making our smoke detector thing after Mrs. Rodriguez's fire." Jake was struck by his son's perceptiveness. He hadn't realized how transparent his commitment to Phoenix had become, or how much Ethan understood about his motivations. Yeah, buddy, that's exactly why it matters. If our system works, it could warn people like Mrs. Rodriguez before a fire even starts. Ethan nodded, satisfied with this confirmation. That's good, because helping people is more important than making money, right? That's what you always say. The simple statement resonated with Jake's core values, reminding him why he'd taken this job in the first place. Not for the salary, but for the potential to create something truly protective. In that moment, his commitment to exposing the sabotage strengthened. This wasn't just about corporate espionage. It was about preventing the system from being buried or compromised. Their vigilance paid off when Jake captured security footage of someone entering the lab at 2:17 a.m. using Reeves's access credentials. The figure moved with purpose directly to the prototype testing area, removing a component and replacing it with what appeared to be an identical part. The camera angle and the intruder's careful positioning prevented clear identification, but the height and build were consistent with Reeves. Jake downloaded the footage to an encrypted drive, then set a trap of his own. He modified the replacement component with a microscopic identifier and adjusted the testing protocol to include an examination for this marker. If the sabotage component made it into the next round of testing, they would have proof of tampering. The day before the scheduled test, Alexandra called Jake to her office. Her expression was grave as she closed the door behind him. We have a problem. Safeguard Systems announced this morning that they're launching a new fire prevention system next quarter. Their press release includes technical specifications disturbingly similar to Phoenix's proprietary features. Jake absorbed this development with growing unease. The leak is accelerating. They're not even trying to disguise the theft anymore. Alexandra nodded grimly, which suggests they believe they've compromised our project so thoroughly that we won't be able to launch before them, rendering any intellectual property claims moot. First to market often trumps original innovation in both public perception and legal battles. The implications were clear. Phoenix was running out of time. Jake hesitated, uncertain whether to share his suspicions about Reeves given their lack of definitive proof. Before he could decide, Alexandra spoke again. The board is meeting tomorrow to consider selling the Phoenix technology to Safeguard rather than continuing development. Her voice remained steady, but Jake detected the underlying strain. They argue it's better to get some return on our investment rather than watching Safeguard launch first with what amounts to our stolen technology. Jake felt a surge of protective indignation. They can't do that. Phoenix is too important to let it be buried by corporate politics. A sad smile touched Alexandra's lips. I said almost those exact words to you once. But the reality is they can and might. Unless we can demonstrate dramatic progress in tomorrow's test, something compelling enough to convince them Phoenix remains viable and ahead of whatever Safeguard is developing. The timing couldn't be worse. Jake's trap was set, but exposing the saboteur wouldn't immediately fix the technical issues plaguing the project. They needed both evidence of sabotage and a technical breakthrough to save Phoenix. Jake made his decision. I think I know who's been compromising the project. He outlined the evidence against Reeves, showing Alexandra the security footage and explaining the marked component trap. Alexandra's face paled as she processed this betrayal by her head of security. Lawrence has been with me for 8 years. He has access to everything, knows all our vulnerabilities. Her hands tightened into fists on her desk. If he's the leak, we need to move quickly but carefully. If we confront him without absolute proof, he could destroy evidence or accelerate the damage. They developed a plan to proceed with tomorrow's testing as scheduled, but under heightened observation. If the marked component appeared as expected, they would have their proof. Meanwhile, Jake would work through the night implementing a modified sensor design he'd been developing, one that combined Phoenix's advanced detection algorithms with a simplified physical architecture inspired by his home workshop creations. Jake called Mrs. Delaney to arrange overnight care for Ethan, explaining he had an emergency work project. The understanding neighbor agreed immediately, assuring him Ethan could stay for breakfast if needed. With that responsibility addressed, Jake threw himself into the technical challenge with focused intensity. The Phoenix lab remained empty except for Jake and Elaine, who had volunteered to assist despite not knowing all the details of his suspicions. Together, they constructed a hybrid prototype incorporating Jake's practical approach to material selection in circuit design with Phoenix's sophisticated software. The result looked less elegant than Wilson's original concept, but promised greater reliability and significantly lower production costs. Around midnight, Wilson himself appeared unexpectedly in the lab, his presence triggering Jake's immediate wariness. "Working late, Turner, must be important to keep you from your son." Jake maintained a neutral expression, covering the prototype modifications with a casual movement. "Just trying to resolve those sensor degradation issues before tomorrow's board presentation." Wilson moved closer, examining their work with critical eyes. "Interesting approach, rather primitive compared to the original design specifications." His tone carried dismissal, but Jake detected underlying curiosity. "I suppose functionality matters more than elegance at this point." Elaine intervened smoothly. "We're implementing some of Jake's suggestions from last week's review. The board wants options if the primary design continues experiencing stability issues." Wilson's expression darkened at this reminder of the project's problems. The primary design would function perfectly if components performed to specification. He gestured toward their prototype with evident disdain. "This retrofit might work as a stopgap, but it sacrifices the long-term vision of Phoenix." Jake recognized the opening to test Wilson's true priorities. Better a simplified system that saves lives reliably than a perfect concept that never makes it to market. Something shifted in Wilson's expression, professional pride battling with pragmatism. After a visible internal struggle, he sighed heavily. "Show me what you're doing. Perhaps there's a middle ground that preserves the core innovation while addressing the stability issues." The unexpected collaboration extended through the night, with Wilson contributing valuable refinements to Jake's design while grudgingly acknowledging the practical wisdom of the simplified approach. By dawn, they had created something neither would have developed independently, a system that maintained Phoenix's predictive capabilities while dramatically improving reliability and reducing production complexity. As the broader team began arriving for the morning's critical test, Jake pulled Alexandra aside to share the night's developments. "Wilson's not our saboteur. He cares too deeply about Phoenix succeeding, even if it means compromising his original vision." Alexandra processed this reassessment quickly. "Which leaves Reeves as our primary suspect. The test begins in 30 minutes. If your marked component appears, we'll have our proof." The board members filed into the observation room overlooking the testing chamber, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile toward the project they were considering abandoning. Alexandra joined them, her professional mask firmly in place despite the pressure riding on this demonstration. Jake, Wilson, and Elaine supervised final preparations, the previous night's collaboration having forged an uneasy alliance. As the technicians installed components for testing, Jake discreetly checked each one for his hidden marker. To his satisfaction and dread, he found it precisely where expected, confirming the sabotage, but raising the stakes for their modified prototype to perform. Lawrence Reeves entered the lab just as they were completing preparations, his presence triggering Jake's hyper-awareness. "Ms. Pierce asked me to observe today's test personally given its importance to the board's decision." Jake nodded acknowledgement while positioning himself between Reeves and the testing equipment. "We're just about ready. We'll be testing both the original prototype and a modified version we developed overnight." Reeves showed no reaction to this information, his professional demeanor impeccable. "I'm sure the board will appreciate seeing alternatives given the challenges the project has faced." The testing proceeded methodically, beginning with environmental simulations designed to trigger the system's predictive capabilities. The original prototype performed as poorly as expected, generating false positives and missing critical warning signs exactly as it had been sabotaged to do. When they switched to the modified prototype, the atmosphere in the observation room visibly shifted. The hybrid design successfully identified potential fire hazards in all test scenarios, distinguishing between normal environmental variations and genuinely concerning conditions. Most importantly, it did so with a consistency that had eluded previous versions. As the final test concluded, Alexander's voice came through the lab speakers. "Dr. Wilson, Mr. Turner, please join us in the boardroom to discuss these results." Jake caught Elaine's eye, silently communicating that she should secure the evidence while he engaged with the board. She nodded, understanding, already moving toward the component storage area where their documentation was hidden. In the boardroom, the board chairman, a silver-haired man with the sharp eyes of someone who'd built and destroyed numerous businesses, addressed them directly. Impressive turnaround, particularly with the modified design. My question is simple. Can this version be ready for production before Safeguard's announced launch date? Wilson surprised Jake by responding confidently. With adequate resources and priority status, yes. The simplified architecture actually accelerates our timeline while reducing manufacturing costs by approximately 30%. The chairman turned to Alexandra. And you're confident this modified version maintains the core intellectual property claims that distinguish Phoenix from competitor products? Alexandra nodded firmly. The innovation was never in the physical components themselves, but in the predictive algorithms and adaptive response protocols. Those remain intact and proprietary. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with board members questioning technical specifications, production timelines, and market positioning. Throughout, Jake noticed Reeves standing silently at the back of the room, his expression revealing nothing as the board gradually shifted from skepticism to cautious support. Finally, the chairman announced their decision. Phoenix would receive continued funding and accelerated development status, with Wilson and Jake jointly leading the technical team. The board members filed out, several stopping to offer congratulatory handshakes that carried the clear subtext "deliver, as promised," or "consequences will follow." When only Alexandra, Jake, Wilson, and Reeves remained in the boardroom, Alexandra closed the door and turned to face her head of security. Lawrence, would you care to explain why components Jake personally marked as compromised appeared in today's testing equipment? Reeves's composure faltered momentarily before his professional mask reasserted itself. I'm not sure what you're implying, Alexandra. Jake produced the encrypted drive containing the security footage. We have you on camera replacing original components with sabotage versions. We have physical evidence linking you to deliberate interference with the project. And we have documentation of exactly which tests were compromised and when. Wilson's expression transformed from confusion to furious as he processed these accusations. You've been deliberately undermining my work. For how long? Reeves' gaze shifted between the three of them, calculating odds that no longer favored him. When he spoke, his tone carried resigned pragmatism rather than remorse. Safeguard made an offer I couldn't refuse. Pierce Technologies pays well, but not retirement level well. They offered a percentage of revenue from their version of Phoenix, enough to set me up permanently. Alexandra's voice went deadly quiet. You betrayed not just the company, but me personally. After everything we've been through together. Something hardened in Reeves' expression. You've always been too focused on the mission, Alexandra. Safeguard understands what Phoenix is really worth: billions, not the modest profits your accessible pricing model would generate. His laugh held no humor. You're using this technology to atone for your father's sins. I simply recognized its actual market value. The deliberate cruelty of the reference to her father struck Alexandra visibly, but she maintained her composure. Security is already on their way up. You'll be escorted from the building and your access terminated. The legal consequences will follow. As security personnel entered to remove Reeves, he looked directly at Jake with cold assessment. She found you because you match a pattern, Turner, technically brilliant, but driven by personal trauma. People like us are tools in her redemption project. When you've served your purpose, she'll find another broken engineer to fix. The accusation lingered in the air after Reeves was gone. Wilson excused himself to begin implementing their modified design, leaving Jake and Alexandra alone in the suddenly silent boardroom. Alexandra moved to the window, gazing out at the campus grounds below. Lawrence was with me almost from the beginning. He helped build Pierce Technologies' security infrastructure from nothing. I trusted him completely. Her voice held the quiet devastation of personal betrayal, layered atop professional damage. Jake approached carefully, uncertain how to navigate this new vulnerability in a woman who typically projected such strength. People have complex motivations. Sometimes even those closest to us harbor desires or resentments we never see. Alexandra turned to face him, her professional mask temporarily abandoned. Is Reeves right about why I brought you into Phoenix? Am I just using you as part of some redemption project? The direct question demanded equal honesty. Jake considered all he'd learned about Alexandra, her tragic background, her driving mission, her complex leadership of Pierce Technologies. I think you brought me in because you recognized something in me that resonated with your own experience. We both understand loss and how it shapes the choices we make afterward. He moved closer, the professional boundaries between them temporarily suspended by the day's intensity. You needed someone who cared about Phoenix's mission as deeply as you do, someone who would fight for it beyond contractual obligation. And yes, you needed someone outside existing power structures who might spot sabotage others missed. Alexandra's eyes searched his, looking for judgment and finding understanding instead. I first became aware of your work years ago when you were still at Techron. Your approach to safety systems was innovative, practical, but effective. When Sarah got sick and you left, I lost track of you. She moved to a nearby chair, suddenly looking exhausted. After I started Phoenix and ran into technical roadblocks, I remembered your patents. We researched several former Techron engineers with relevant experience. Your name was on the shortlist. Jake leaned against the conference table processing this information. So you did know about me before the fire? In a general sense, yes. We knew your professional background, that you'd become a mechanic after leaving Techron. Our HR department sent you a standard recruitment email about 6 months ago, but we never received a response. A faint smile touched her lips. I assume it went to spam or looked like just another corporate solicitation. Jake vaguely recalled deleting several such emails without reading them, assuming they were generic recruitment attempts. And then the fire happened. Alexandra nodded. Pure coincidence. When Lawrence told me who had pulled me out, I couldn't believe it. The same engineer whose work I'd admired years before, who had dropped off the professional radar, suddenly reappearing in the most dramatic way possible. Her expression softened with remembered wonder. It felt like the universe creating an opportunity I couldn't arrange myself. The revelation painted their meeting in a new light, not entirely chance yet, not the calculated recruitment Jake had sometimes suspected. Their paths had been set to cross eventually. The fire had simply accelerated and intensified the connection. Before Jake could respond, his phone vibrated with an incoming call from Ethan's school. He answered with immediate concern, listening as the school nurse explained that Ethan had fallen during gym class and might have sprained his wrist. Nothing serious, but he needed to be picked up. I have to go, Jake explained to Alexandra after ending the call. Ethan's hurt at school. Alexandra nodded immediately. Of course, take whatever time you need. We can continue this conversation and address next steps with Phoenix when Ethan's taken care of. As Jake hurried toward the parking garage, he reflected on how seamlessly his parental responsibilities now integrated with his professional role at Pierce Technologies, a balance that seemed increasingly natural rather than forced. The day had brought multiple revelations, confirmation of sabotage, an unexpected alliance with Wilson, the betrayal by Reeves, and most significantly, a deeper understanding of Alexandra's interest in him. Their connection wasn't simply professional or even personal. It was built on shared values, complementary skills, and parallel experiences of loss and purpose. Whatever came next, Jake sensed they would navigate it together, each bringing their unique strengths to both the Phoenix project and whatever relationship might be developing between them. The drive to Ethan's school gave Jake time to process the day's events. Reeves' betrayal, while shocking, explained the persistent problems that had plagued Phoenix. With the saboteur identified and removed, and with the modified prototype showing promise, the project's future looked brighter than it had in months. But more than the technical breakthroughs or corporate intrigue, Jake found himself thinking about Alexandra. Her vulnerability in sharing her true background, her determination to transform personal tragedy into public protection, and the way her hand had felt briefly interlaced with his. There was potential there beyond professional collaboration if they both chose to explore it. As he pulled into the school parking lot, Jake set these thoughts aside. Right now, his son needed him. There would be time later to consider the future of both Phoenix and his connection with Alexandra. For now, he was simply grateful that his life had expanded to include meaningful work alongside his most important role as Ethan's father.